The year was 1978, and the winter did not arrive in the Blackwood Valley. It descended like a sudden, unforgiving judgment. It was the eve of what meteorologists would later call the Great Polar Vortex, a cyclonic bomb of atmospheric fury that shattered records and broke the spirit of men who thought they owned the Earth. At 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, nature ceases to be merely a season. It becomes an executioner. At this terrifying temperature, the very air turns hostile, stealing the breath from your lungs and turning the moisture in your eyes to glass. Down in the affluent basin of the valley, the wealthy cattle barons and arrogant estate owners were facing the collapse of their modern illusions. For years, they had mocked the old ways, placing their blind faith in the altar of the industrial age. They had built sprawling mansions of glass and steel, outfitting them with imported $3,000 diesel boilers and complex grid-dependent heating systems. They believed their bank accounts were a shield against the cosmos. But money cannot alter the laws of thermodynamics. As the blizzard howled with the roar of a freight train, ripping ancient pines from their roots, the modern world began to die. Power lines snapped like dry twigs under the sheer weight of the ice. Without electricity, the sophisticated pumps of the elite seized up. The copper pipes inside their lavish walls, carrying water that should have meant life, froze solid and burst like gunshots in the dark. In the grand driveways, the diesel fuel in their expensive trucks began to gel, turning to useless wax. The valley's elite, men who had spent their lives looking down on the humble, were suddenly trapped inside 3-story iceboxes of mahogany and leather, wrapping themselves in imported rugs, watching their breath turn to white smoke in their own living rooms, staring wide-eyed at a cold they could not buy their way out of. Yet, as the pendulum of fate swings, we look away from the freezing mansions. We move 3 miles up the timberline, into the teeth of the gale, where the snowdrifts were piling as high as a man's chest. There, hidden behind a grove of shivering aspens, sat a rotting, forgotten pioneer cabin. It was a shack the town had long abandoned, deemed useless, a dilapidated relic of a bygone era. But inside this fragile wooden shell, the air did not bite. It embraced. There was no roaring furnace. There were no diesel fumes. There was only absolute, profound silence, accompanied by the gentle crackle of a small cast-iron wood stove no bigger than a toolbox. The temperature inside this cabin was not plummeting. It held steady, unwavering, at a perfectly comfortable 64 degrees Fahrenheit. In the corner, lying on a modest cot, was 5-year-old Leo. He suffered from a weak chest, a fragility of the lungs that meant the freezing air outside would be an instant death sentence for him. But here, he was fast asleep, his face flush with warmth, his chest rising and falling in deep, peaceful rhythms beneath a simple quilted blanket. Sitting vigil beside him was Mave. She was only 16 years old, cast out, discarded, a girl possessing absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and the fierce, unyielding love for her little brother. She wasn't trembling in fear of the white inferno outside. She was calmly mending a torn sock by the soft amber glow of an oil lamp. The apocalypse raged against the thin, weathered wooden siding of the cabin, the wind screaming for entry, but the cold could not penetrate. It was physically repelled. Because hidden within the dark cavities of those walls, sandwiched between the rough-sawn planks, lay a secret. It was a secret that had cost exactly $7. It was absolute refuse. The filthy, grease-laden, matted dags. The waste wool sheared from the hindquarters of the valley's sheep. It was the garbage the wealthy ranchers burned or threw into ditches because it was too dirty for the textile mills. Yet, transformed by the desperate ingenuity of a marginalized teenager, This trash had become an impenetrable, high-performance fortress of microscopic dead air pockets and natural, moisture-repelling lanolin. How does this happen? How does modern engineering, backed by limitless capital and arrogance, fail so miserably, while a teenage girl and a pile of dirty, discarded animal hair conquer a climatic nightmare? The answer, as it has been since the dawn of time, lies in the forgotten memory of the earth. We, as a society, have been conditioned to worship the complex. We are taught to pay exorbitant prices for fragile machines and synthetic materials, and we are trained to despise the raw, simple, profound gifts of nature. The men who were currently freezing in their grand estates down in the valley had laughed at Mave. They had publicly mocked her. When she dragged sacks of their discarded wool through the mud, they had pointed and sneered, attacking her logic, telling her that dirt and sheep grease would only rot her walls, that she and her brother would freeze to death in a week. But nature does not care about arrogance. Nature does not care about your social standing. Nature only respects those who understand its rules and humble themselves before its power. To understand the profound poetic justice of this historic winter night, to comprehend the science of how trash became salvation, we must rewind the clock. We must go back to the bitter, fading days of autumn, to the exact moment a vulnerable child was thrown out into the cold by her own blood. But before we walk back into the chilling autumn winds and witness the ultimate triumph of ancestral knowledge over modern hubris, I invite you to join our fireside. If you believe that the old ways still hold the power to save us, that true wealth is found in wisdom rather than bank accounts, leave your like on this video. Subscribe to our channel to help us preserve these forgotten truths, and share this story with those who still value the quiet dignity of the earth. And tell me, guardian of the legacy, from which city in the world are you listening to this broadcast today? Leave it in the comments below so we may know how far the warmth of our hearth has traveled. Now, let the wind howl. Let us return to the beginning. The bitter winds of late autumn had already begun to strip the golden leaves from the aspens when the final blow fell. It was mid-October, and the earth was hardening, preparing for its long, frozen sleep. Just 2 days after the modest burial of her mother, 16-year-old Mave stood on the polished hardwood floors of the grand ranch house she had briefly called home. She held her 5-year-old brother, Leo, tightly by the hand. The boy's breathing was already shallow, a persistent, rattling cough echoing in his small chest, a warning of the fragility of his lungs in the damp mountain air. Standing before them, framed by the roaring hearth of a massive stone fireplace, was her Uncle Silas. He was a man whose soul had been paved over by ledgers and bank accounts. Silas was a prominent cattle baron, a man who measured his worth by the acreage he owned and the zeros in his investments. To him, an orphaned niece and a sickly nephew were not blood. They were a liability. They were an incalculable expense in an otherwise perfect financial projection. "I run a business, Mave, not a charity ward," Silas had said, his voice as cold and flat as a steel blade, adjusting the cuffs of his imported wool suit. "I have my own legacy to build. You are old enough to work, and the boy is a burden I did not ask for. Take your mother's blankets and leave. I need this wing of the house cleared for the new boiler installations." And just like that, the decree was handed down. No physical violence, no raised voices, just the sterile, bureaucratic cruelty of the modern elite. The social eviction was absolute. Walking out of the iron gates of the estate, Mave possessed nothing but a small canvas sack of clothes, a few family photographs, and exactly $7 in crumpled bills hidden in her shoe. The wind bit through her thin coat, but she did not cry. She could not afford the luxury of tears. Her sole purpose in the universe was the small, trembling hand she held in hers. Her motivation was not pride, nor anger, but the primal, fierce instinct to protect an innocent life from the encroaching jaws of winter. They walked for miles, leaving the manicured roads of the valley floor, ascending into the rugged, forgotten timberline. There, hidden among the encroaching pines, they found it, an old pioneer cabin. It was a skeletal remnant of the 1800s, built by men who had long since turned to dust. It was a shelter, but just barely. The roof, though intact, covered a structure that was terrifyingly porous. The logs had shrunk and shifted over the decades, leaving gaps in the walls wide enough to slide a hand through. The wind whistled through these cracks, playing a mournful, chilling tune. Inside, it was barely warmer than outside. It would keep the rain off their heads, but when the mercury plummeted, this cabin would simply become a wooden tomb. Mave knew that without insulation, Leo's frail lungs would not survive the first frost, let alone the deep winter. Down in the valley, men like Silas insulated their modern mansions with expensive, newly engineered fiberglass bats, costing thousands of dollars, backed by roaring diesel furnaces. Mave had no thousands. She had $7. But she had something the wealthy barons had traded away for convenience. She had observation. She had the memory of how the natural world operated before machines blinded humanity. 2 days later, the valley's elite gathered at the massive communal shearing sheds for the final autumn clip. The air was thick with the smell of lanolin, diesel exhaust, and cigar smoke. Silas and the other ranch owners stood by their shiny, idling trucks, boasting about the upcoming winter. They loudly discussed their $3,000 imported boilers, laughing at the sheer volume of fuel they had stockpiled. They felt like gods, masters of their climate, entirely disconnected from the earth beneath their expensive leather boots. Mave approached the men, her worn shoes silent against the dirt. She did not ask for charity. She did not ask for a loan. She pointed to the massive, festering pile of waste at the edge of the property. In the sheep industry, there is a byproduct known as dags. This is the wool from the hindquarters of the sheep. It is heavily matted, caked with hardened mud, feces, briars, and saturated with an overwhelming amount of heavy, greasy lanolin, the natural oil produced by the animal. The textile mills refuse it. It is entirely useless to the modern market. To the wealthy ranchers, it was garbage. It was a smelly nuisance that cost them time to burn or bury in deep trenches. "I want the waste wool," Mave said, her voice steady, despite the trembling of her hands. "The dags. All of it." The laughter that erupted from the men was not just cruel. It was filled with the arrogant certainty of modern ignorance. Silas stepped forward, a mocking smile playing on his lips, acting as the mouthpiece for their collective hubris. "You want the garbage, girl?" Silas sneered, looking her up and down. "What for? You going to knit a sweater out of sheep manure?" "I am going to stuff the walls of the old pioneer cabin," she replied calmly, "to keep my brother warm." The ranchers erupted again, slapping their knees. This is where the elite always falter. They mistake a lack of capital for a lack of intelligence. They attacked her logic with the venom of men who believe only money buys solutions. "Are you completely insane, Mave?" One of the neighboring estate owners barked, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "That trash is wet. It's full of grease and dirt. You pack that into wooden walls, and the dampness will rot the timber in a month." "You can't trap heat with garbage," Silas added, his voice dripping with condescension. "Air passes right through dirt. You'll freeze in a tomb of wet mud and grease. You need engineered fiberglass and a proper heating system, not a pile of manure. You're going to kill that boy with your stupidity." They asked the questions that the modern mind always asks. How can dirt insulate? How can wet, greasy waste keep out a freezing wind? They believed that because the material had no commercial value, it had no thermodynamic value. Mave stood her ground. She did not try to explain the physics she understood instinctively. She knew that defending the truth to arrogant men was a waste of breath. "If it's garbage," Mave said softly, "then let me take it." Silas's eyes narrowed, his cruelty finding a new, opportunistic angle. "I don't give handouts, Mave, even for garbage. It costs me labor to pile it up. If you want it, you buy it. $7 for the whole rotting pile." It was an extortionate, humiliating demand for something he was going to set on fire anyway. It was a final attempt to break her spirit. Mave reached into her worn shoe. She pulled out the crumpled bills, her entire net worth in the world, the only barrier between her and absolute starvation. She handed the $7 to Silas. The transaction was complete. Silas pocketed the money, shaking his head at what he perceived as the ultimate foolishness of the poor. As Mave began the grueling, humiliating task of dragging dozens of heavy, foul-smelling sacks of waste wool away from the sheds, the men turned their backs, returning to their discussions of $3,000 boilers and grid power, certain that they would find the girl and her brother frozen solid before Christmas. They did not know that for $7, the teenage girl had just purchased an impenetrable shield against the apocalypse. They did not know that while they worshipped the heat of burning diesel, Mave had just bought millions of microscopic, moisture-proof, heat-trapping vaults. The physical toll of dragging over 200 pounds of saturated, filthy wool up the mountain was a brutal test of endurance. For 3 days, beneath skies that were turning a bruised, ominous purple, 16-year-old Mave hauled the heavy burlap sacks. Her hands blistered and cracked in the biting wind, but they were soon coated in a thick, yellowish wax. It was the heavy grease of the dags. The very smell of it, musky, earthy, and pungent, would have sent the wealthy women of the valley running for their imported perfumes. But to Mave, that scent was the smell of survival. As she worked, she drew upon a wealth that Silas and his bank accounts could never confiscate: ancestral memory. Her grandfather had been an old-world shepherd, a man who spent his life walking the rugged highlands. He had not worshipped machines. He had worshipped the profound, silent intelligence of the earth. He had once pointed to a flock of sheep standing calmly in a roaring blizzard, their backs piled high with untouched snow. "Look at the snow, Mave," the old man had whispered. "It does not melt on their backs. Do you know why? Because the heat from their blood never reaches the surface. The cold cannot get in, and the warmth cannot get out. The modern man thinks he can invent a better shield than what the Creator spent millions of years perfecting. He is a fool." Mave held on to that wisdom as she began the grueling process of retrofitting the decaying Pioneer cabin. She scavenged discarded, warped timber and broken pallets from the town dump, creating a crude but sturdy inner wall, leaving a hollow cavity of about 6 inches between the new boards and the old, drafty exterior logs. Then came the meticulous, dirty work of insulation. A modern contractor would have washed the wool. They would have scoured it with harsh chemicals and boiling water to strip away the dirt and the grease, rendering it sterile, fluffy, and commercially acceptable. But Mave knew that washing the waste wool would be a fatal error. By removing the filth, she would be removing the magic. Instead, she simply picked out the largest, sharpest briars and the hardest clumps of mud, leaving the heavy oils and the grime entirely intact. Handful by handful, she began to stuff the raw dags into the 6-inch wall cavities. Here is where the sublime physics of the natural world eclipses the fragile engineering of the elite. The secret to thermal insulation is not the material itself, it is what the material traps. Heat transfers through three methods: radiation, conduction, and convection. To stop the cold from creeping in and the heat from escaping, one must stop the air from moving. The raw sheep's wool is constructed of complex, microscopic overlapping scales, creating millions of tiny crimps along every single fiber. When packed together tightly, but crucially, not too tightly, these crimps interlock to create millions of microscopic dead air pockets. Because the air inside these tiny vaults cannot circulate, convective heat loss drops to absolute zero. But the true genius of Mave's $7 investment lay in the grease she refused to wash away: the lanolin. Lanolin is a natural wax secreted by the sebaceous glands of the sheep. It is profoundly hydrophobic. Down in the valley, the wealthy ranchers had spent $3,000 on modern fiberglass bats, but fiberglass has a fatal flaw. When exposed to the heavy freezing dampness of mountain fog, it acts like a sponge. Once fiberglass absorbs moisture, the water bridges the air gaps, instantly conducting the freezing cold directly into the house, destroying its R value and spawning toxic black rot within the walls. Mave's unwashed, garbage wool was impervious to water. The heavy lanolin acted as an absolute, natural vapor barrier. When the freezing mountain humidity penetrated the outer logs of the cabin, it hit the greasy dags and was violently repelled. The moisture could not enter. The dead air pockets remained bone dry. Furthermore, the dense, heavy logs of the pioneer cabin acted as thermal mass. As Mave lit a small fire in her rusted, scavenged cast-iron stove, the gentle heat radiated outward. It was absorbed by the thick wooden logs and instantly trapped by the unyielding barrier of the lanolin-soaked wool. The walls began to breathe, regulating the humidity perfectly without surrendering a single degree of temperature. It was a masterpiece of passive thermodynamic engineering, achieved by a teenage girl using the discarded refuse of arrogant men. But arrogance is a loud and persistent ghost. On the afternoon of the fourth day, as the sky darkened into a terrifying slate-gray canvas and the first dry, stinging flakes of snow began to fall, the sound of a heavy diesel engine shattered the silence of the woods. It was Uncle Silas, accompanied by Mr. Vance, another wealthy estate owner. They were driving their expensive 4x4 truck along the timber line, doing a final check of their perimeter fencing before retreating to their fortresses of glass and steel. They spotted Mave standing on a wooden crate, shoving the last handfuls of filthy dags into the gap above the doorframe. Her clothes were stained dark with sheep grease. Her face was smudged with dirt. Silas rolled down the window, the blast of his truck's premium heater wafting out into the freezing air. He looked at the dilapidated cabin, then at the sacks of waste, and burst into a cruel, booming laugh. "Still playing in the dirt, Mave?" Silas shouted over the rumble of his engine. "I see you've managed to make this old shack smell like a slaughterhouse." Mr. Vance leaned over, his eyes filled with the supreme misplaced confidence of a man who trusts brochures over biology. He decided to attack the girl's logic, wielding his modern ignorance like a weapon. "You're building a tomb, girl," Vance mocked, pointing a gloved finger at the walls. "You can't use unwashed organic matter. The R value of dirt and grease is 0. That dampness will freeze solid the second the temperature drops. Air will blow right through that fluff, and whatever is left will decompose and rot the wood. You need a continuous polyethylene vapor barrier and engineered fiberglass, not sheep sweat." "She's too stubborn to listen, Vance," Silas sneered, shaking his head with mock pity. "She thinks she knows better than the engineers who built my $3,000 boiler." "Listen to me, Mave. When the storm hits tonight, That little stove of yours won't do a thing. That wet garbage in your walls is going to turn to a block of ice. I'll send the sheriff up here in a week to collect you and the boy. It's a shame, but you brought this on yourself." They did not wait for an answer. They rolled up their tinted windows, secure in their mobile bubbles of burning fossil fuels, and drove back down the mountain toward their sprawling estates. They laughed all the way home, entirely blind to the fact that they were mocking the very laws of physics that govern the universe. Mave did not shout back. She did not defend herself. The wise do not waste their breath trying to explain the ocean to a man who only believes in puddles. She quietly stepped down from the crate. She wiped her greasy hands on an old rag, feeling the profound, waterproof barrier the lanolin had left on her skin. She walked inside the cabin and closed the heavy, uneven wooden door. Inside, little Leo was sitting up on the cot, coughing softly. "Is it going to be cold, Mave?" he whispered, his large eyes wide with fear as the wind began to whistle a higher, sharper pitch through the pines outside. Mave walked over, placed another small piece of scavenged scrap wood into the tiny iron stove, and locked the latch. She put her hand flat against the inner wall. Behind that thin layer of scrap wood lay a fortress of millions of hydrophobic, dead air vaults, silently waiting to do what they had done for thousands of years. "No, Leo," she said, her voice a calm, unwavering anchor in the gathering dark. "We are going to be very warm." Outside, the first howl of the polar vortex crested the mountain peak, and the great white hell descended upon the valley. It began not with a flurry of snow, but with a sound. It was a low, terrifying hum vibrating through the bedrock of the valley, the sound of the atmospheric pressure violently collapsing. The barometer did not just drop, it plummeted into the abyss. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the sky had turned the color of bruised iron. Then, the great polar vortex slammed into the Blackwood Valley like a physical wall of crystalline ice. The temperature did not gradually decline. It fell off a cliff. Within 2 hours, the mercury shattered the 0-degree mark and kept plunging, bottoming out at a lethal, historic 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the physical rules of the world change. Metal becomes brittle. Trees snap like dry bone under the sheer stress of the freezing sap within their trunks. The wind, howling at over 70 miles per hour, transformed the falling snow into millions of horizontal, microscopic razor blades. Down in the affluent basin, the illusion of modern supremacy evaporated in an instant. It started with the power grid. The heavy, ice-laden transmission lines, strung across the mountains like fragile spiderwebs, could not withstand the cyclonic fury. Transformers exploded in flashes of eerie blue light, instantly swallowed by the whiteout conditions. In a matter of seconds, the entire valley was plunged into a suffocating, terrifying darkness. Inside his sprawling, multi-level estate, Uncle Silas stood in his living room as the lights flickered and died. The comforting, low hum of his electrical appliances vanished. But more terrifying was the silence that followed from the basement. His brand-new $3,000 imported boiler, the pinnacle of engineered heating, required electricity to run its complex ignition and circulation pumps. Without the grid, the massive machine was nothing more than $3,000 worth of dead, useless steel. Silas was not immediately panicked. He had backup generators. He bundled up in a heavy cashmere coat and fought his way through the blinding snow to the utility shed to fire up the diesel engine. But here, the arrogance of the elite met the merciless chemistry of nature. Modern men forget that diesel fuel is not magic. It is a petroleum product containing paraffin wax. As the ambient temperature plummeted toward -40, The fuel in Silas's outdoor storage tanks reached its cloud point. The liquid wax crystallized, turning the diesel into a thick, useless, gelatinous sludge. The fuel filters instantly clogged. The generator cranked, sputtered, and died. It would not start again. The pendulum of survival now swung violently up the mountain into the teeth of the gale. While the valley floor descended into panic, the rotting pioneer cabin stood directly in the path of the roaring blizzard. The wind shrieked against the weathered exterior logs with the force of a freight train, but inside, a profound, almost holy miracle of physics was taking place. The temperature inside the cabin was exactly 64 degrees Fahrenheit. 16-year-old Mave sat by the tiny scavenged cast-iron stove, watching the flames slowly consume a piece of scrap pine. The heat radiating from the iron was modest, barely enough to warm a single room under normal conditions. But the heat did not have to fight the cold. It was perfectly trapped. The millions of microscopic crimps in the $7 worth of garbage wool she had packed into the walls were holding trillions of invisible pockets of dead air. The howling wind outside could not penetrate this organic fortress. Furthermore, the extreme acoustic dampening properties of the dense wool absorbed the terrifying roar of the storm. While the rich were deafened by the rattling of their massive glass windows, inside Mave's cabin, the blizzard sounded like a distant, muffled whisper. Little Leo was sound asleep, his breathing deep and clear. The heavy lanolin grease in the walls was performing its masterpiece. As the freezing, humid air of the storm tried to infiltrate the wood, the hydrophobic wax repelled it instantly. The interior remained perfectly dry, preventing the bone-chilling dampness that usually accompanies mountain blizzards. The heavy, rammed earth floor and the thick interior boards absorbed the gentle heat of the stove, acting as a thermal battery, radiating warmth back into the room with absolute stability. Down in the valley, the nightmare was escalating. By midnight, the temperature inside Silas's grand mansion had dropped below freezing. The expensive fiberglass insulation in his walls, without the roaring boiler to keep the interior warm, began to fail. Fiberglass cannot stop moving air. The aggressive, negative 40-degree drafts penetrated the tiny gaps in the modern construction, slicing through the fiberglass bats like a knife through cotton. Then came the sounds of structural death. Water is the only abundant substance on Earth that expands when it freezes. The elite had built their mansions with thousands of feet of expensive copper piping, creating artificial veins of water throughout their walls and ceilings. Without the boiler pushing hot water through those veins, the water sat still. The freezing cold gripped the copper. The water inside crystallized, expanded with an unstoppable hydraulic force, and the pipes began to violently burst. Crack, hiss, snap. It sounded like gunfire in the dark. Silas and Mr. Vance, who had fled to Silas's house when his own heating failed, huddled together in the massive living room, their breath plumed in thick white clouds. The $3,000 imported leather sofas were freezing to the touch. The grand stone fireplace, designed for aesthetics rather than thermal efficiency, sucked all the warm air straight up the chimney, leaving the room bitterly cold. The social hierarchy had collapsed. Their bank accounts, their stock portfolios, their thousands of acres of land. None of it could raise the temperature of the room by a single fraction of a degree. The cold is the great equalizer. It does not negotiate with wealth. It only respects preparation. Driven mad by the plummeting temperature and the terrifying realization of their own mortality, Silas and Vance resorted to the ultimate act of desperation. They took an axe from the garage. Weeping from the stinging cold, they began to smash Silas's antique mahogany dining chairs, furniture worth more than Mave's entire existence. They threw the lacquered, expensive wood into the inefficient fireplace, trying to generate enough heat to survive until dawn. They burned their wealth just to keep their blood moving. They sat shivering, listening to their massive house tear itself apart from the inside, their minds plagued by the arrogant words they had spoken just days prior. They had mocked a teenage girl. They had called her a fool for trusting dirt and animal grease. As the pendulum swings back one final time for the night, we return to the silence of the timberline. Mave did not have mahogany to burn. She had broken pallets and fallen branches. But because she had honored the ancestral wisdom of the earth, because she had built a shield of dead air and lanolin, she didn't need a raging bonfire. A handful of embers was enough. She walked over to her brother's cot and gently adjusted his blanket. His skin was warm. The air was stable, holding perfectly at 64 degrees. She looked at the rough, uneven wooden planks of her walls. Behind them lay the filthy, discarded dags, the trash of the elite. For exactly $7, Mave had bought the one thing the billionaires in the valley could not afford that night: absolute peace. She blew out the oil lamp, plunging the warm cabin into darkness, and went to sleep while the great white hell continued to break the pride of the modern world outside her door. Dawn did not break over the Blackwood Valley. It merely diluted the darkness into a pale, terrifying gray. The great polar vortex had parked itself over the mountains, a stationary engine of atmospheric destruction. The wind still howled, but the snow had stopped, leaving behind a landscape that looked less like a valley and more like the surface of a dead, frozen moon. The temperature remained brutally locked at 38 degrees below zero. Inside the grand estate of Uncle Silas, the situation had crossed from desperate into lethal. The last of the antique mahogany dining chairs had burned down to fine gray ash hours ago. The imported Persian rugs, the $3,000 leather sofas, the towering bookshelves of unread classics, none of it could generate another spark. The interior of the sprawling mansion had reached an agonizing 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The frost was no longer just on the windows. It was creeping across the hardwood floors, climbing the walls, and settling over the heavy, useless radiators. Silas and Vance sat huddled beneath a mound of cold, synthetic luxury blankets, their breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Their lips were a terrifying shade of blue. The early stages of hypothermia were setting in, stripping away their arrogance and leaving behind nothing but the primal, shivering animal fear of death. They knew that if they stayed in that frozen tomb, their hearts would simply stop beating before noon. "The girl," Silas rasped, his voice barely a whisper through chattering teeth. "The cabin." Vance looked at him through frost-caked eyelashes, his mind sluggish. "She's dead, Silas. That shack, it's a coffin." "The stove," Silas managed to say, forcing himself to his feet, his joints screaming in protest. "She had an iron stove. Even if the fire is out, even if she's gone, the iron might still hold some heat. We can break it down. We can use it." It was a grim, macabre calculation born of absolute desperation. They did not expect to find survivors. They only hoped to scavenge from the dead. Wrapped in layers of useless, freezing designer coats, the two millionaires forced the heavy front doors open and stepped out into the great white hell. The cold hit them like a physical blow, driving the air from their lungs. Every step through the waist-deep snow was an agonizing battle against the heavy, gelid resistance of their own freezing blood. Their expensive, insulated boots, designed for brief walks from heated cars to heated offices, proved entirely inadequate against the biting, negative 38-degree reality of the mountain. The 3-mile trek up the timberline took them nearly 2 hours. They fell repeatedly, their hands growing numb, their minds drifting into the dangerous, warm hallucinations that precede freezing to death. But the primal instinct to survive dragged them forward, inch by inch, until the silhouette of the rotting pioneer cabin finally materialized through the swirling ground drifts. They stopped. They blinked, certain that their dying minds were playing tricks on them. There was no frost on the inside of the cabin's small, wavy glass window. Instead, a soft, amber glow radiated from within, cutting through the bleak morning light, and from the rusted tin pipe jutting from the roof, a thin, steady, beautiful ribbon of white smoke was rising defiantly into the freezing sky. Silas collapsed against the heavy wooden door, no longer a proud cattle baron, but a broken, dying man. He raised a heavy, numb fist and struck the wood. Thud, thud. A moment later, the latch clicked. The heavy door swung inward, and then it hit them. It was not just warmth, it was a physical embrace. A solid wall of 64-degree air rolled out of the cabin, carrying with it the earthy, comforting scent of wood smoke and the deep, musky, unmistakable aroma of heavy sheep's lanolin. To the freezing men, it was the smell of absolute salvation. Standing in the doorway was 16-year-old Mave. She was not shivering. She was not huddled in fear. She was wearing a simple mended sweater, holding a tin cup of warm water. Behind her, little Leo sat on the floor, playing quietly with a carved wooden block, perfectly safe, perfectly warm. Silas fell to his knees on the threshold, the snow crunching beneath his weight. He looked up at the niece he had discarded, the girl he had condemned to death to save a few dollars on his ledger. He looked at the walls of the cabin, the very walls he had mocked. He expected her to slam the door. He expected her to demand the thousands of dollars he had in his frozen bank accounts. He expected the bitter, triumphant gloating of the vindicated. He deserved nothing less. But true wisdom does not harbor the petty venom of the arrogant. The guardian of knowledge knows that nature has already delivered the lesson. The human ego does not need to add to it. Mave looked down at the broken, shivering men. Her expression was solemn, carrying the quiet, ancient dignity of the earth itself. "Come by the fire, Uncle Silas," she said softly, stepping aside. "You are freezing." No demands, no conditions, just sublime, unconditional grace. The two millionaires crawled into the dirt-floored cabin. They slumped against the inner walls, shaking violently as the profound, stable heat began to thaw their frozen blood. As Silas leaned his head back against the wood, he realized what was radiating that life-saving warmth into his spine. It was the dags. It was the filthy, unwashed, discarded refuse of his own sheep. The $7 of garbage he had forced a vulnerable child to pay for was now the only thing keeping him alive in a valley where millions of dollars had just frozen to death. The heavy, unwashed lanolin had acted as a perfect, impenetrable shield, violently repelling the deadly mountain humidity that had destroyed his fiberglass insulation. The millions of microscopic, interlocking crimps in the dirty wool had trapped the gentle heat of the tiny stove in an unbreakable matrix of dead air pockets, creating a thermodynamic fortress that his $3,000 diesel boiler could never replicate. As he sat there, weeping silently in the dim amber light, the final, crushing weight of the moral lesson settled over him. We live in an era that worships the complex and despises the simple. We have built an elite class that believes dominion over the earth can be purchased with synthetic materials, grid dependency, and endless capital. They look at the ancient, low-tech wisdom of our ancestors, the mass of the earth, the physics of natural fiber, the geometry of passive heat, and they call it primitive. They call it garbage. But when the sky turns black and the machines fail, when the fragile illusions of the modern grid collapse under the weight of the natural world, bank accounts freeze just as quickly as the men who hold them. Mave did not survive because she conquered nature. She survived because she listened to it. She understood that the earth provides everything necessary to sustain life, if only we have the humility to accept it as it is, raw, unwashed, and deeply, profoundly intelligent. The true wealth of humanity is not found in the sprawling, freezing mansions of the valley floor. It is found in the quiet, resourceful resilience of those who remember the old ways. It is found in a 16-year-old girl who took the world's rejection, stuffed it into the walls of a forgotten cabin, and turned it into an impenetrable shield of life. This is the legacy of the Blackwood Valley. It is a testament to the undeniable truth that ancestral wisdom and deep humility will always outlast the fleeting arrogance of the modern age. If this story ignited a fire within you, if you believe that we must protect and remember these sacred low-tech truths before they are completely erased by the noise of the industrial machine, then join our fireside. Leave your like on this video to help this warmth reach others. Subscribe to the channel to become a guardian of knowledge alongside us, and share this audio documentary with anyone who still respects the raw power of the natural world. And before you go, tell me, my fellow traveler of the old roads, from which city are you listening to this manifesto of resistance today? Leave your location in the comments below so we may know how far the embers of this truth have scattered across the earth. Stay warm, stay humble, and never forget the wisdom of the ancestors. Until the next storm, this is your narrator, signing off.